Okay, we have already started recording. So thank you very much, everybody, for your joining us today for the AIAA Los Angeles Las Vegas section town hall meeting. We really highly appreciate. We have a very exciting presentation today. I'll mention to you a little bit about this background. But first of all, I just want to mention today the topic is aerospace cybersecurity. In case you didn't know, you can look at AIAA.org website. Aerospace cybersecurity has been one of the top priority for AIAA national effort. So because everybody is using computer, then you have the systems, software and the communications and AI, these you need a lot of security in the cyberspace. And AIAA view this aerospace cybersecurity very seriously. It's a very main topic, for AIAA. And also like a digital twins. Dennis talked about digital twin. That's kind of very important thing. And JPL, many places they have been using a lot of tools and they need very, very good cybersecurity. And the other thing, in case you didn't know, AIAA just established the Aerospace Artificial Intelligence (AI) Advisory Board, National Advisory Board. So AIAA has been watching all the new developments for those kind of things, cybersecurity and AI, how do they play out in the aerospace community. So it's very, very important. We actually have been doing as a local chapter, LA, Los Angeles, Las Vegas section, we have been doing quite several aerospace cybersecurity events to let people know the importance of what they can learn. The most recent will be the one in September. We have the retired Air Force Colonel from Space Command, Jennifer Kolikowski, Colonel Kolikowski, right here in this room, talk a bit about this cybersecurity importance. And today we expert will tell us more. But before we go that, some logistics. So for people online, I asked the speaker, so you are welcome anytime. You can raise your hand. We'll enable your microphone. You're welcome to speak out to interrupt her. But you're also welcome to reserve your question all the way to the end. Even though today's setting is more like a webinar, but you can still get the mic enabled and speak out. That's the best way. But of course, your microphone doesn't work. You can type your question. We'll do the best to help you. So we just heard from Mr. Kumar, Santosh Kumar. He was able to speak out using microphone. That's actually better. And then for the folks here, the restaurant is on the back side to your left-hand side. And what else? And we have the donut here. Krispy Kreme donut, very nice. And tomorrow is Super Bowl, so we have the football donut. That's a souvenir for folks here in person, so please grab it. Having some fun before Super Bowl. I was thinking about getting the donut for Valentine's Day, but Super Bowl first. Football is more important. Just kidding. Because it's tomorrow, that's why I'm having some fun here with bottled water. So that's for folks here. And the folks here, you just raise your hand, during the talk or at the end. And after the talk, and you are welcome to stay here, network with the speaker about this. And so the next thing, okay, then we can move. AIAA is, as you know, a nonprofit organization, membership-based professional organization. We have more than 30,000 members around the world. And it focuses on professionalism and education. Those kind of things. Remember working in all the major aerospace industry, and we have 4 university student branches in the Los Angeles Las Vegas section. We have Cal State Long Beach, UCLA, USC, and UNLV. The reason why I mention it, 2 weeks from today, actually -1, Friday, February 23rd, we are going to have a LALV section University Student Branch Mini Conference in Long Beach with spin launch. And we're a speaker from Aerospace Corporation. We intend to help the student connect to the industry. We're also getting exhibitor from Aerospace Corporation and some other company. So that just lets you know that who we are, and in our board with members from JPL, Northrop Grumman, amazing. And for example, our advisor, Dr. Jeffrey Pushell, is AIAA Fellow. He has recently been inducted to National Academy of Engineering, Dr. Jeff Pushell. Then we have many folks that are very good for every aspect of aerospace. We also folks, our young professional chair is in Lockheed Martin, and many different, we are a group of professionals get together to help the community, that's to be sure. Our speakers are all volunteer, like Rick on the back, he's going to give a talk with Dennis on the back. They're all our volunteer speakers. They're going to give a wonderful talk in March 9. So please join us in Longdale Library. So the other thing, okay, now I can, if you're not a member yet, please go to aiaa.org/join. High school membership is free, educator is free, and young professional get 50% off. And in case you forgot to renew, it's very important. If you stay with a membership for continuously for 50 years, you become emeritus, and you don't have to pay anything anymore. Then we also have lifetime membership, those kind of things. Please enjoy. So that's typically, and the LA chapter here, we are blessed with many aerospace activity, anything you can think of, from eVTOL, e-aircraft to SpaceX, the relativity space. I just heard Sanji talk about this 3D printing. They have relativity space right in Long Beach. They build 3D rocket, 3D printed rocket. And Dennis used to work in Northrop Grumman. It's a very exciting place. They just had the Cygnus sent to space too. So we have many people here and come from variety. And even though you're not in the aerospace, it's good to get involved. So I took a little bit long time because I want to make you sure to get familiar with AIAA. So I'm going to get to this, our speaker, Angelina Tavoy. Sorry, I connected Angelina. I always think about the movie star, but she is also like the rising star of the aerospace. She is from Chadwick College. She's also a pilot. She's also a very good programmer. She has been instructor for cybersecurity. So one thing I want you to be aware that even though you might have to look at her background and she is in high school, but I can tell you these days in high school students, they have doing wonderful jobs, especially in these days in LA area. I've been telling people, 2 days ago, I served as a judge in the Palos Verdes High School, and the students were doing neural network, in the ChatGPT, artificial intelligence, machine learning, supernova analysis, and space debris salesman traveling program. It's just amazing. And before that, the even students claim that they show the 4-vector tensor. They proved Einstein was wrong in general relativity, quantum mechanics, complicated computation, and even doing things like femtosecond laser. So I can tell you these days young people are doing amazing things. So don't have any prejudice that high school or so there must be something that. But you will be very surprised. And actually, before Angelina today, we actually have 2 or 3 talks by high schools that is actually very wide opening. But on the other hand, they are actually just getting started with their career. Although they are very experienced doing wonderful job, but some people of you might be director or very experienced in cybersecurity or any field. So please give very good suggestion and advice. Please keep in mind they are beginning their career, but you will be surprised how knowledgeable and experienced they are. So here I'm handing the microphone to Angelina. So please enjoy the great presentation. Again, if you have any questions, you are welcome to raise your hand. Online folks, please click raise hand and we'll enable your mic. You can speak out. So without further ado, let's welcome Angelina Tavoy.
Thank you so much, Kenneth, for presenting this opportunity to me. I've been an AIAA member for a few years now, and I've always had a very enriching experience every time I've come to one of these events. I always end up connecting with really bright individuals and learning a lot about what's going on within the aerospace tech sphere. So today I'll be talking about my experience within aerospace cybersecurity, and it'll just be general anecdotes of what I've learned within my experience doing all sorts of things within the aerospace realm. I've worked with drones, I've done aviation related work since I got my private pilot license. I've been doing auditing of avionics systems, and I'll mostly be talking about satellites and how you can integrate security practices in order to secure space systems. Because we're realizing now that as the space economy increases and we're seeing more development and more launches of satellites, we need to be really putting security at the forefront. So a lot of vulnerabilities affiliated with satellites are not taken advantage of. Okay, so a little bit about my background. I started off in software about a decade ago, and I have a pretty extensive computer science experience developing mobile systems, web applications, so forth. And then I transitioned into cybersecurity a few years ago after working at a security company. And since then, I've done projects.
Could you please share, because it's not showing this, could you share online?
Interesting.
If not, try it again.
I'm so sorry.
Oh, no problem, no problem. It's not showing up.
You have to mirror them in system preferences.
Should be presenting.
It's coming up, but it's a bit slow. Okay.
Yeah,
think
and
that is-
Angelina, I think if you go to system preferences and mirror the displays, it'll show up. in both
Yeah, or it
places.
might be the network that's slow because I'm connected to my hotspot right now.
Okay, okay. Okay, they can see, they can
You can
see.
see it? Can you see it? Okay, cool.
They can see.
Wonderful. Okay, continuing. Yeah, and then within my cybersecurity experience, I kind of lead weight into aerospace after doing an internship with NASA and learning about space vehicle infrastructure. And then I got into instructing with cybersecurity. I started instructing pretty basic like hardware hacking based workshops, but then I wanted to put my own spin to the cybersecurity workshops I was doing. And I partnered with organizations such as Redia and Pentest Magazine in order to give satellite and aerospace specific lectures in order to make sure that they were built with security in mind. I also own a little side company called Stellarix Labs that I founded a few months ago. Currently, we're focusing more on consultation and training and education. Most of the lectures I've been doing have been confined to in-person settings. So usually I do workshops at conferences. I've been at DEF CON and other like various makerspaces around here, but our mission is to provide that for a more global audience and not just locally here in Los Angeles. Okay, so I just noticed the bars up there. I'm sorry about that. It's okay. Okay, there we go. And let me move it. Okay. So there are three, I would say, the main reasons for having security embedded within space systems are threefold. Firstly, there is a prominent lack of security, especially within development of space infrastructure. And we're seeing this a lot because of resource constraints, and especially with startups and companies that aren't really funded being introduced into this sphere. We don't have a lot of companies that are focusing on security because they want to get a working product out immediately. A lot of security is just put on the side until it actually really becomes a problem. And this is also extremely important because as the space market expands over the next few years, as it is projected to, it's really important to be paying attention to these vulnerabilities that are intrinsic to these space systems, especially as the attack surfaces on these systems become increasingly more complex and dependent upon space technology. So in terms of previous case studies, there have been multiple instances of satellite-based attacks that have occurred in the past. The most prominent one, it was on a US-German collaboration satellite called the Rosat satellite. And this was back in 1998, where a group of hackers were able to compromise computers located in Goddard Space Flight Center. And they were able to send malicious commands up to the satellite that caused it to rotate its solar panels. And since space has a relatively harsh environment, any minute adjustment of specific components, such as the solar panels, could cause wide-scale repercussions. And in this case, rotating the solar panels directly towards the sun caused the batteries on the satellite to fry, and the satellite subsequently crashed back into Earth in 2011. In terms of more modern hacking attempts, we've seen a lot of jamming and spoofing related communication attacks on Starlink satellites. And this was really prevalent, especially during the Ukraine-Russian conflict, where Russian-affiliated hackers were trying to compromise internet services that were provided by the Starlink constellation. In terms of more research-based telescope satellites, this is really recent. I think it was in August of 2023. The National Science Foundation's NORLAB experienced multiple hacking attempts, which led to suspension of 2 astronomical observation laboratories. So when we're talking about security, we can typically segment it within the 4 categories outlined. There's the space, ground, link, and user. And usually these are all very interconnected, and vulnerabilities exist between the connection between these various categories. So the space segment outlines various activities and systems directly within space. So this can be satellites themselves, various space vehicles, and so forth. The ground segment consists of communications systems, ground stations, and then there's the link segment, which is responsible for coordinating the communication between various space vehicles located within space, or space and ground, or ground and ground. And this includes things such as radio, packets, communications, and so forth. And then lastly, we have the user segment. And this is for commercial services. This is when you want to access services provided by space. So this could be something like a typical dish antenna in order to get video broadcasts, internet, Starlink, very small aperture terminals, and so forth. So this is an outlined case scenario of how the various...
While you are talking, I think the bandwidth is limited, so online people is very slow. So can I try to get Wi-Fi?
I think the Wi-Fi here, I was connected to my hotspot.
Yeah, the hotspot is a little bit slow.
Let me pause.
Yeah, let me explain. Folks online, sorry, because we are trying to adjust to connect to the faster internet, so you can see there's less delay in your seeing the chart. Does it take 1 minute? Yeah, pull it down to the bottom.
Hopefully that works.
Yes, can you share?
Yeah, I can share it again.
This is for the project. It's not online though. No. Sorry for the temporary issue. Okay, yeah, I think it's okay now. Go ahead.
Can you move this?
Yeah, now it's showing better. Faster. Okay, we're back on track. So don't worry about those things. That's online people, they have no problem. It's only.
Okay, can I see it now?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I'm glad we got that resolved near the beginning. So this is a typical segment breakdown of what a space infrastructure would look like. You can see there's various connections between various segments. So we have the ground, we have space, we have the links, which is like the arrows that point to each of the different subsystems, and then we have the user segment. And a lot of vulnerabilities, especially in terms of space systems, exist between the communication links, since it's the easiest way you can get access to these systems. And it also reveals like the amount of attack surfaces and vulnerabilities between each of the different segments. I think a lot of people, when they think of satellites, they typically just think of the ground and the satellite communication link, but there's also many different avenues a hacker can pursue in order to compromise a system. Okay, so for the majority of this presentation, I'll be using satellites as an example. I think they're pretty typical when you're dealing with space systems, and it's easy to outline the security vulnerabilities, especially with how they have been designed from scratch. Just a general overview of what a satellite is. A satellite is any object in space that orbits or circles around a bigger object. There's artificial and natural satellites. We're going to be focusing on artificial satellites. And those are things that are engineered and put into orbit in space. So that could be the International Space Station, different internet service providers that chose to launch their own satellite constellation. And satellites are a pretty broad target because they can do a wide range of things. There's communication satellites. Satellites do remote sensing, so climate research, astronomical satellites, navigation satellites like GPS, GLONASS, and so forth. So they're a really wide target, and they provide a wide range of services, which exploited could result in a lot of damage. So whenever you're trying to outline threats that could possibly attack a satellite, there's a 4-phase structure that is ingrained within the mindset of exposing vulnerabilities that may be intrinsic to the system. So firstly, there's the tracking phase, and this is mostly where you're trying to gather information, because you can't attack a system if you don't have any information about it. So this is where you use techniques such as open source intelligence and other forms of reconnaissance in order to figure out specific vulnerabilities that might be hidden within a satellite. Then you need to listen. Like I mentioned before, a lot of vulnerabilities exist within the communication links of satellites. So this is where hackers use something called eavesdropping, where they listen in on communications that's taking place in order to see the data and understand what kind of private information is being sent. And then once they're able to listen into it, they go through the decoding and reverse engineering phase. And this is where you're getting the communications from the satellite and then interpreting it, because when satellite communications are being sent, there's many covert ways of hiding and protecting the data. So we'll talk about this later, but a lot of satellites have modulation schemes and various ways where they encrypt information. However, all the encryption techniques or modulation schemes that are being used within the radio communication links of satellites are very easy to reverse engineer, where a hacker can take a look at it and they can figure out patterns within the data that can help them decode what kind of like private information is being secured inside of data packets in order to get relevant telemetry. And then lastly, once you're able to get that information, that opens up a lot of exploits that can be executed on a satellite during the hacking phase. So diving into phase one, which is reconnaissance, hackers do this by many different ways. You can use open source intelligence by using publicly accessible websites and data sets. And what they're looking to do is gather information relevant to the hacking scenario. So most of the time, this will involve orbital configuration, like Keplerian elements, where the satellite is going to be within space, mission, which space vehicle launched the satellite, any affiliated organizations, or organizations within the supply chain that provided components for the satellite, and communications information. So you'll have uplink frequencies, downlink frequencies, any crosslink frequencies it might have with other satellites. And this is all really relevant for attacking it because there's a very narrow communications window that a hacker has with the satellite. So especially when you're trying to hack into a space system, timing is really important. And getting information about the various subsystems is also really important as well. The most common way of running reconnaissance on space systems is through a technique called OSINT, also known as open source intelligence. And this is used within a wide range of hacking scenarios, not exclusively just for space systems. But this is a method of information gathering by analyzing pretty much any accessible document or data that's already accessible on the internet. So for example, this could include finding profile usernames on social media, looking through website metadata in order to find past website exploits, so sifting through public records to do like personnel open source intelligence, or in the case of satellites, you can do geospatial analysis with satellite imagery. OSINT plays a huge role within the space sector because it's really important for finding threat intelligence and analyzing risks that are affiliated with satellite systems. So examples of this include obtaining telemetry information from a spacecraft in space by analyzing like publicly accessible data. You can also get very specific vendor information. You see this a lot with drone-based attacks, but with satellites as well, you can get vendor information from the various like components that are located in a satellite. And you can also do things like geospatial intelligence, where you look through various satellite imagery repositories and locate events that are going on, or people that might be at a specific place, or look through various locations on a map. In the case of satellites, what hackers are typically looking for are the following. They're looking for any forms of identification. So this includes the type of satellite. What is it for? Is it for astronomical purposes? Is it for providing internet? Any companies or organizations it might be affiliated with. So typically they look through the supply chain and see which sorts of like subsystems and components that are located on the satellite in order to get organization-based data, launch date, location, and so forth. And then we have orbital parameters. This is for hacking context. So if you want to hack into a satellite, like I mentioned before, the amount of time you have to do it is very limited because satellites are constantly assuming a speed in orbit. So you typically have a few minutes to compromise a satellite, especially because since satellites are so far away from us, the communication between the satellites is not very good. A lot of attenuations happen to the signal from the satellite, causing signals to be garbled, and an attacker, if they were looking to transmit something, possibly coordinate a jamming or a spoofing attack, they have a very narrow time span to do so. You can also do a lot with satellite imagery. You can look for various infrastructure systems, environmental trends, and do a lot of remote sensing analysis with satellite-based imagery data sets. And lastly, you can decipher which protocols and encryption methods are being used on satellite communication systems. And this could reveal a lot, especially when you're trying to analyze vulnerabilities in ground control infrastructures, encryption methods, and it really helps out during the decoding phase of an attack. These are general things I mentioned before, but specific examples. So for orbital parameters, this will include Keplerian elements. Keplerian elements describe specific characteristics of how a satellite is oriented in space. And two-line element sets, also known as TLEs, it's just like a condensed data format for information about satellites and where they're located. In terms of communications, that's radio frequencies, possibly frequencies of a transponder in order to get information and communications from it. And lastly, passes and ground track. This is really important if you're trying to coordinate a ground-based attack from it, from like a ground station, making sure that you have a satellite that is within radio visibility, so you can coordinate and communicate with the satellite. So there's three main ways you can get information about a satellite. There's publicly accessible websites, which is extremely easy to do because there's so many resources out there that reveal information. So a few main sites would be Celestrak and N2IO, and they provide generalized satellite information such as two-line element sets and general information about where a satellite is oriented above you. There's also past prediction software such as AMSAT that provides a website suite where you can understand when a satellite is going to be passing over you, and then you can visualize orbital elements using a site like orbital mechanics. Another way you could perform OSINT on a satellite is reading over documentation by a manufacturer, and usually they outline various components of a satellite. So they'll say, oh, this is a transponder, and this is the frequency it uses, this is the encryption method it uses. So you can find out a lot about specific subsystems by reading over accessible documentation. And lastly, I would say this would be the last resort, but it is possible. When you go through the first two phases of looking over publicly accessible websites and reading over documentation, you can also do direct interception. That's where you tune into the communications of the satellite and gather telemetry readings. And then from there, you could try to decode those readings and get more private or discrete data. So a case study you can actually do at home is the International Space Station, and you can pull up a website like N2IO, and you can get all sorts of information about a satellite. So I just typed in the international designation, the NORAD ID of the ISS, which is 25544, into the N2IO website, and it showed me exactly where it's going to be passing Next, the start azimuth and azimuth, the ground track relative to my location, and the orbital elements. So a hacker, let's say they had a ground-based transmitter, they know where to orient it in order to track down a satellite. They know what time they need to be at a specific location in order to exploit a satellite. I just wanted to talk a little bit more about two-line element sets. Like I mentioned, this is a very commonly used data format used to record and report the positions and orbits of artificial satellites. And this includes things like mean motion, eccentricity, inclination, all like characteristics of a satellite in orbit, so you know how you can target it. And with that information, you can plot where a satellite will be oriented near you, so you can coordinate some kind of communications-based attack. So just a general note on tracking and OSINT, it's typically used to find opportunities for exploitation. So this is purely a passive phase. We'll talk about passive and active attacks a little bit later in this presentation, but when you're dealing with anything having to do with reconnaissance, you're not actively attacking a satellite, but this is absolutely imperative in order to coordinate an attack in the future, because you need to figure out where a satellite's going to be oriented above you, what sorts of systems it relies on, and what sorts of infrastructure it already has in order to pinpoint vulnerabilities and outline an attack surface. And this involves looking through different components that are located on the satellite, and by sifting through various public data sets and information about the component layout of a satellite, you can start putting the puzzle together and figure out what sorts of exploits that might be inherent to the satellite. So after you gather information about a satellite, phase 2 consists of listening and eavesdropping. This is typically done using signals intelligence. And since most satellites use radio frequencies, you can use a lot of open source radio platforms, software, in order to decode communications that are being sent in space and figure out data. And this data can include telemetry, sensor readings, so this could be like volts, amperage, like how much resources is being sent to different components on a satellite, its location, so forth. Payloads are what causes an action to occur in a satellite. So let's say you want the satellite to change its attitude within orbit. That would be in the form of a payload. Payloads also contain commands, which you could analyze. You can also create your own payloads and cause a spoofing attack, which you can force or entice a satellite to do a specific thing. You can also eavesdrop for media. This is really popular especially for digital video broadcast satellites or remote sensing satellites that send down a lot of imagery-based data, which you can perform reconnaissance on. There's also private or discrete information. Let's say you were able to eavesdrop into a satellite constellation for an internet service provider. Then you can get access to a lot of private credentials, leading to problems. From my research on satellites in the past, I would say communications is one of the key vulnerabilities inherent to satellite systems. And this is mostly because of the long-range form of communication. A lot of signals, like I mentioned before, directed from a ground station to a satellite are pretty weak because satellites are far away and there's a lot of environmental conditions. Like let's say it's really cloudy, really rainy, signal's going to get attenuated and it's not going to be as strong as typical like ground to ground, or let's say like ground station to like cell tower communications. It's relatively weak, making it easy to exploit. So you can outline communications between a satellite in 3 stages. There's the uplink, the downlink, and the crosslink, which isn't outlined here. The uplink is signals that are sent from a ground station to a satellite. So most of the time, this will be commands. A lot of data is sent from the C2 link, the command and control link, from a ground station to a satellite. So you'll see a lot of subsystem specific payloads. So commands telling a specific satellite subsystem to do an action. There's the downlink. This is mostly for sending down media and assets. So a lot of imagery satellites, they'll send down imagery. You'll have radio satellites sending down audio, so forth. And a lot of satellites have a component called a transponder on them. And a transponder is a device that is used to convert a received signal to another frequency and then retransmit it via the downlink. And usually satellite manufacturers outline the frequency of the transponder in their guidelines. And it's a great point of executing or starting an attack in terms of reconnaissance, because you can derive a lot of information that is being sent from the transponder. I also wanted to mention frequency and bands. So satellites that use radio to communicate with one another and to communicate with ground stations are partitioned into segments. So you have like very low frequency, high frequency, and so forth. And you have them segmented into the letters that are shown here at the bottom of the image. So there's the L band, the S band, C band, X band, and so forth. And those, what the satellite communication system is assigned to in terms of frequency depends on what it's used for in application. So you see a lot of maritime radios that are located in the X band, while more astronomical-based imagery satellites are in the Ka band. So this leads to a general discussion about SATCOM. SATCOM stands for Satellite Communications, and this is a network infrastructure used by satellites to provide broadband internet around the world. This could include other media services like mobile television and radio broadcasts. And this was located on the L band, which is from 1 to 2 gigahertz. So the 3 main problems with SATCOM are that firstly, there's no universal security guideline yet. So especially with up and coming companies, it's really a shot in the dark in terms of whether they should implement their own proprietary encryption protocol or use something that's standard like AES. So with no really outlined universal security guideline, companies don't really know what to take it, and that leads to economic concerns. Small companies who are trying to launch satellites into orbit really don't have the money to spend or the time to spend on developing their own independent encryption protocols. Since it's really burdensome to develop your own custom encryption protocol, a lot of independent companies are not really partaking in the task of doing it in lieu of time and resource constraints. There's also technical issues involved with having a universal encryption method. Like I mentioned before, signals from the satellite travel really, really long, and this makes it at risk of things such as packet loss and latency. You have a lot of factors in play here. And if you don't get encryption right, a lot of the infrastructure based off of satellite systems will not work. So it's a huge complicated mess in terms of implementing encryption. So a lot of companies, especially smaller ones, just choose not to implement encryption standard at all because they just want to save time. It's also surprisingly easy to do this. A typical hacker, let's say they were a script kiddie, they could use very basic equipment, such as like a satellite dish antenna, or something more directional like a Yagi antenna, alongside a software-defined radio. You could use something like the RTL SDR, which is a $20 to like $40 software-defined radio kit, and feed it the satellite communications into a decoder software in order to obtain communications. So it's relatively easy to do, and you don't need much to do it. All you need is some kind of past prediction software, a decoding software, and a few equipment to retrieve signals from a satellite. A case study of this is with GNSS. GNSS stands for Global Navigation Satellite System, and this is used to pinpoint where you are located on Earth. And one very common attack targeting GNSS is GPS spoofing. This is where you can fake where you are on Earth by sending malformed data up to a satellite. So for example, let's say right now I'm here in Los Angeles, I can spoof that I am in New York and I'm in the time zone of New York by sending a misconstrued packet to a satellite. And this can be done using relatively cheap hardware with transmission and receiving capabilities. So GPS spoofing can be executed using something like the HackRF1, which is like a $300 radio kit that has transmission and receiving capabilities. And you can send it file information containing GPS data and spoof where you are located on Earth. Once you're able to receive signals from a satellite, you'll have to go for the decoding and reverse engineering processes. And this is important because if a satellite does use encryption, you'll get a bunch of bits or data that is obfuscated or encrypted, meaning that a hacker would have to decode it and figure out the message that is ingrained within the satellite signal that is being sent. So types of data that is transmitted by satellite systems include the following. You have a lot of navigation and tracking signals. There's also telecommunication signals for media-based services, remote sensing data, pictures, audio, alongside telemetry such as like spacecraft health statuses and operational information. In terms of decoding, it typically consists of demodulation and then the decoding part. Demodulation is a technique used to understand radio signals and convert it into binary. So the way information is transferred between satellite systems and ground stations is that in order to send information for space, they convert binary into a radio wave and then they transmit it, because you can't send out binary data. Like you can't have like a cable that connects a satellite to a ground station. That doesn't work. So you need to convert it to a radio wave so you can pass it through space. And then once you demodulate data, which consists of using some kind of software-defined radio, you'll get binary or just like garbled encoded data, and you'll need to decode it. And Decoding often consists of understanding what packet framing structure the signal assumes and figuring out patterns and making inferences in order to get the relevant data you are targeting. This leads us into reverse engineering. Reverse engineering is a technique used by hackers in order to analyze signals that are being sent from a satellite in order to get its original format. This can be done by looking for various packets and outlining patterns within packets of information being sent from a satellite. And once you're able to reverse engineer and understand the bytes that are underlying a message, you can convert it into binary code and then decode it into whatever you're trying to do. So for example, with weather satellites, you can demodulate signals from those satellites and then convert it to a bunch of binary. And if you format the binary correctly and you're able to reverse engineer it, you can get something like an image to the right. You can also do this with audio, pretty much any media format alongside text and values that are being sent from a spacecraft. You also have very common space packets, which is really helpful in terms of reverse engineering. So for example, the CCSDS packet format is a protocol used for a lot of space systems, and understanding that there are formats already in place that are highly regarded, it just makes the reverse engineering process easier because you'll know that most of these packets adhere to a protocol because a lot of companies don't really invest a lot of time into making their own proprietary protocol, meaning that you can use a standardized format and obtain data and reverse engineer the data relatively easily. And lastly, once you're able to extract the relevant data for an attack, you can go about exploiting and hacking, which is coordinating a very specific attack by targeting an inherent vulnerability of an attack surface. And there's two types of attacks you can do. There's active attacks and then there's passive attacks, which is more common. Active attacks include very direct actions against a space system. So, for example, you have jamming, kinetic attacks, lasers. This is the really dangerous stuff. Usually you need to have some form of equipment to do this. And then there's passive attacks. This is for gathering intelligence. Let's say you get access to very confidential information and you exploit it. And hackers typically use a variant of signals intelligence, spoofing, and surveillance to coordinate passive attacks. And typically, there's four main vulnerabilities that hackers try to hone in on when they're exploiting a space system. There's communications, which I would say is the most common. This includes jamming and spoofing. Jamming is where you flood a communications link of a satellite so many times that it gets confused. Spoofing is a little bit more clever. You're trying to make information seem like it's real, even though it's fake. So for example, you have GPS spoofing where, let's say you fake you're in a different location, you can actually trick the satellite to really thinking you're at a specific location, even though you're somewhere else. Physical systems, this is a little bit more expensive, and you don't really see a lot of script kiddies doing this, or beginners doing this, but this includes electromagnetic attacks, lasers, laser eavesdropping, missiles, so forth. And then there's firmware and software-based attacks. This will include fuzzing software in order to discover vulnerabilities, manipulating software, manipulating data that is being sent to the software in order to confuse it. And lastly, we have targeted attacks against the ground station themselves. This is common because you don't need gear. For the other three ones, you typically do need some kind of communications gear, like a transmitter in order to send a satellite something. But if it's directly to a ground station, you can use any machine and have it send data there. So this could be something like hijacking, denial of service, and so forth. In terms of communication-based attacks, we have spoofing and payload injection, which is transmitting false data to confuse a satellite. There's eavesdropping, which is tuning into unauthorized communication links to get access to private information. And then lastly, there's denial of service, which consists of overloading a communication channel to a satellite in order to cause unnecessary interference to a satellite's activities. In terms of securing these systems, improving encryption techniques will be the most important. So implementing some kind of very strong end-to-end encryption like AES is typically very helpful. Also, improving the enhanced authentication methods that are being used and making sure that you're using protocols like TLS in order to vet the data that is being sent. And lastly, having some sort of intrusion detection where you have a software or something that's consistently monitoring a communication link to detect for suspicious activity like a denial of service or jamming, spoofing. In terms of software and firmware that is being run on the satellites, there's 4 main attack points. There's malware injection, which is when an attacker tries to upload malicious software to perform unauthorized actions. There's hijacking of the C2 link. The C2 link stands for command and control. And this lets any unauthorized user or personnel to send commands and manipulate operations on a spacecraft. There's also firmware tampering, which is modifying code in order to introduce backdoors and malware into a space system. And lastly, there's persistent implants. This is specifically crafted software that is designed to stay on the satellite for a very long time in order to get long-term attack access to any operations it wants access to. And I would say the main way to mitigating this is implementing secure coding practices. And this is typically done by adhering to guidelines for software development and trying to figure out vulnerabilities intrinsic to the software from the beginning. So you see a lot of standards such as NASA's JPL Rule of 10, where you have a guideline specifically set in stone for developers to audit through the software. There's also code scanners and auditors to review through your code. And you can statically analyze code using various compilation tools. And also implementing security techniques within the coding process itself. So obfuscating your code and minifying it as much as you can, because if a hacker were to get access to the firmware or software running on a satellite, they can run a wide range of techniques. Usually fuzzing is the most common, and fuzzing is when you run specific unit tests, specialized tests against the software to find any vulnerabilities it might have, like backdoors or anything. In terms of physical and kinetic and non-kinetic attacks, most of this is hypothetical, but the technology to do this does exist. There's missiles and ballistics, which can be launched with an intent to physically destroy or compromise a satellite. Non-kinetic attacks, such as electromagnetic waves, where you can use high-powered microwave radiation or covert radio frequency signals to cause interference with a satellite or cause damage to electronic components, which is what high-powered microwave radiation can do. Specifically within the optical link with lasers, you can use lasers directed towards the satellite in order to blind any optical sensors it might have, cause damage to satellites, or any of the communication equipment on board. Another attack vector includes ground stations. Ground stations are equipped with a wide range of communication equipment, and they are responsible for planning, monitoring, and executing satellite operations. And typically what they do is they have large storage centers to decode and archive data to end users, making them really vulnerable to attacks such as unauthorized access, spoofing, and injection of malware. So in terms of securing these systems, there has been more push to get secure by design principles ingrained within the engineering processes of space systems. And this is a common collective standards established by highly accredited organizations like the Department of Defense, the NSA, making sure that space systems go through a rigid auditing process to make sure that they follow by cybersecurity guidelines. And three main techniques that are used in secure by designs are attack surface analysis, subsystem outlining, and threat matrices. Attack surface analysis is taking like a holistic view of the systems affiliated with a space system. So this would be ground, any communication links, radio protocols, and so forth. There's also, when you're looking at specific components and you're specializing down to the satellite itself, subsystem outlining is really helpful because it helps you outline various components that are used on the satellite and pinpoint affiliated risk factors. And then lastly, threat matrices. This is for prioritizing threats based on probability and damage control. So some threats will be inherently more dangerous than other ones. And this just helps designers and engineers prioritize which threat they should focus on depending on the context. So talking a little bit about satellite subsystems. Satellite subsystems are grouped components of a satellite that collectively work together in order to fulfill a specific task. So examples include communications. This will be like the transponder. This will be your antenna. Anything that is affiliated with how communications on a satellite operates. Power and electrical. So this will include things like your battery, solar panels. And then we have the command and data handling, which will include any onboard bus systems you have, onboard computer, and so forth. And this ties into subsystem outlining, and this is a very common technique that is used in order to outline specific threat vectors that might be targeting a satellite. So for example, power system, an outline for that could be disabling solar panels. Let's say a hacker were to get access and send malicious packets. They could effectively disable all the solar panels located on the satellite and reduce the power supply, cause some kind of system malfunction. For the thermal control subsystem, this could include manipulating how thermal regulation works, and especially within a harsh environment like space, this could cause immediate overheating or excessive cooling, which is not good. Then you have, for the propulsion system, sending commands to affect the satellite's attitude within orbit, change its positioning, data handling and processing. This could include sending direct commands to the onboard computer of a satellite in order to inject malware. And then lastly, for a navigation system, this could include altering navigation data that is fed to that satellite in order to cause a satellite system to become confused within how it's oriented in its orbit and mislead its trajectory. As for threat matrices, this is a very organized method for cyber system risk assessment. And this is an example used by SPARTA, which is a regulation standard for space systems, and this outlines which cyber threats are important and which ones should not be emphasized based off of the likelihood, the probability of an attack actually occurring, and how much impact it would have. So for example, I boxed 3. You can see SVAB1 is communication system jamming, and that's located in the top right corner since it would have a lot of impact and it's really easy to do, as compared to something like SVAC4 right here, which is not as much of a threat because you can properly mitigate insider threats to a satellite and it's not as likely to occur. And then lastly, we have SVIT5, which is very unlikely to occur and won't have as much of an impact, which stands for like getting unauthorized control of a satellite computer. Typically, those types of attacks don't occur, and it's harder to do as opposed to something like communication system jamming. And then we have attack surface analysis, and this is just a very general, holistic overview of vulnerability analysis for all the space segments, including the components themselves. And examples of this could be for data, making sure you have message encryption in place, spacecraft software, making sure you have a secure operating system. So you're just generally like outlining different components that are with a satellite system. So in this case, it would be like the space segment, and outlining specific vulnerabilities in order to get an attack surface list. And there's tools you can use to do this. 2 very common ones is the attack standard, and there's SPARTA, which is like a very specialized form of attack for space systems. And it gives you like this really nice display, and it includes all stages of the satellite attack processes, from reconnaissance to execution to defense evasion and impact. And it allows you to outline an attack or analyze previous attacks coordinated against a satellite in the past to analyze what went wrong. In terms of upgrading space cyber resilience, there are multiple directives and standards being put into place. There hasn't been anything internationally regarded or like universally regarded yet, but there are specific ones like Space Policy Directive 5, NASA Space Asset Protection Standard, and the Aerospace Organization's Cybersecurity Protection for Spacecraft document. For the Space Policy Directive 5, this was a directive issued by the US in 2020, aimed at enhancing the cybersecurity for space systems and infrastructure. And the 3 main things it outlined were communications protection, so making sure you have security in place against jamming and spoofing attacks, analyzing supply chain risks, because when you're building space systems, you're getting a lot of components, and all those individual components might have affiliated cyber risks. And lastly, making sure that encryption and proper authentication access was allotted. In terms of integrating security into development standards, you can break that down into 4 main categories. One is robustness, making sure that when you have different subsystems on a satellite or any space vehicle or any space system, making sure that one subsystem or like one component isn't responsible for handling everything. So you want to make sure that different, you have diversity in terms of functions. So let's say you have a specific functionality, making sure different components of a satellite is able to handle it. Opaqueness is also really important, especially for writing code or firmware for a satellite. This makes it difficult for a hacker to conduct reconnaissance because it's it makes it difficult for any intelligence to be gathered by a space system. Also, putting constraints in place. So if a hacker were to hypothetically get access to a space system, you can limit what they can do. An example of this is mitigating lateral movement. Lateral movement is the ease of which a hacker can exploit different aspects of a satellite. So confining what a hacker can get access to if they were to get access. And lastly, responsiveness, making sure that there's multiple ways for handling any threats or attacks, making sure you have simulation environments in place where you can simulate an attack and you can integrate responsive systems in order to mitigate the damage that can be done. You can also think of security on systems in terms of layers. A very common model for this is OSI. This is applied for the communication processes of computer networks, but it's also helpful for understanding space systems. And you have like these 7 layers, and the top one would be the most like abstract. So the application, you have presentation, session, transport. This is how like information is being sent all the way down to the physical layer. And when you apply it to space, application would, and presentation and session would be affiliated with the software and the firmware. The network layer would be in terms of forwarding data packets and communications about a satellite. The data link is the physical communication links themselves, and then the physical layer includes like radio signals, electromagnetic wave emanations. And then lastly, I would say making sure that security regulations emphasize the OBC, also known as the onboard computer. And there's 4 main ways you can do this. Operating system is really important, making sure you have some kind of real-time operating system or a custom-built operating system for embedded environments. There's actually a very specific organization called Space OS that does this, and they use a very contained environment based off of a programming language called OCaml to make sure that the operating system is hyper secure for satellite-specific applications. Making sure you have a good code environment in place is also integral. So having secure by design, coding standards like JPL Rule of 10, also bus communications. Bus communications is the internal communications of a satellite. So for example, a bus would connect the onboard computer and allow it to communicate with the communication subsystem, to allow it to send commands to the payload. So the bus ties everything together in terms of communications internally in a satellite. And you want something that is secure. So for example, let's say a hacker were to implant a malware into the satellite, it can't get access to the telemetry information that is being sent or any information that is being sent internally. And lastly, having encryption in place with the onboard computer is important as well. Ways security can be more streamlined is by consulting other developers and security researchers, and one way of doing this is via bug bounties. You see a lot of aerospace organizations contributing and like outlining their systems on various bug bounty forums, such as SpaceX. You also have NASA, and a bug bounty rewards security researchers to hack into their systems or discover vulnerabilities in their systems within a confined environment, and they usually give like a cash reward in order for security researchers to pinpoint a bug or a vulnerability that might exist, but not really execute anything malicious. And those, and you see a lot of popularity in terms of bug bounty systems because it gives an avenue for people who are unaffiliated with aerospace organizations to contribute. We also have CVE submissions. A CVE stands for Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures. And a CVE is just a standardized identifier assigned to a publicly disclosed cybersecurity vulnerabilities. And you're seeing a lot of CVEs that are affiliated with space systems becoming more streamlined. So for example, SatLink's very small aperture terminal recently had a CVE reported against it. You also have CVEs for satellite modems and so forth that are making it more accessible to look into cybersecurity vulnerabilities. In terms of education and simulation, virtual machines for specialized space security applications is also becoming more prevalent. Virtual machines provide a virtualized computing environment where you can simulate various tasks that occur on a space system, such as like on satellite onboard computers or ground stations, in order to test for security measures within a confined environment, so you don't have anything go wrong on the actual onboard computer or the actual computers that are operating on the ground station. And lastly, we have space-focused CTFs. CTFs are mini competitions for hackers that are typically designed for a specific threat analysis scenario. And one very popular space-themed CTF was orchestrated, I think, a few years ago by a DEF CON Aerospace hacking community. And they launched, I think last year, they launched a satellite in space called the Moonlighter that is purely just an environment, it just purely provides an environment for teaching people who are interested in space security how to compromise a satellite system in a safe system. So it does limit how much you can do to it, but you can do all sorts of cool stuff, like retrieving imagery from the Moonlighter. You can also get telemetry readings, so it's really interesting. In terms of the evolving atmosphere of security in space, there's a lot going on. I would say three main shifting elements in regards to this would be lasers and photonic-enabled systems. So lasers are being employed, especially for ground communications and ground and satellite communications, and intra-satellite communication links to enable for faster data rates that are more secure and have a higher capacity for transmitting data. However, this doesn't stop other satellites from intercepting those communication links and figuring out what information is being sent. So as you see the transition from radio communication to laser communication, it just introduces another avenue for exploiting a satellite system. One really interesting trend is the use of quantum encryption for satellites. So this would hypothetically introduce unbreakable encryption standards for data integrity, but all this is purely research-based. So you have a research satellite called QKDSat, which demonstrates quantum key distribution on a satellite. I think it was founded by the ESA. However, these have not gone widestream yet. And lastly, you're seeing international regulations starting to become developed. IAAA has an international regulation standard committee that's currently developing an international standard to make sure that all space vehicles and all space systems adhere to secure by design principles. And it's really interesting to see how those organizations are helping to bolster more secure by design discussions in the satellite atmosphere. In terms of getting involved, there's multiple communities within aerospace that allow you to get more information about what's going on within this security tech sphere for space systems. There's a lot of conferences like DEF CON that have aerospace specialized villages. There's also specific space-specific cybersecurity conferences like Hackspace Con, which is coming up in April. And you can also take part in competitions at local conferences like Hackasat. Another great way to get involved is contributing to open source aerospace programs. So let's say you have a computer science background and really want to get hands-on knowledge, you can contribute to open source aerospace systems like F-Prime or SatDump in order to learn more about signals intelligence in relation to satellites. And lastly, you could participate in bug bounties if you're more from a security standpoint, where you could look through various aerospace organizations. I know NASA has a lot, SpaceX as well, on sites like BugCrowd in order to see what sorts of security research is being run with those organizations. Just a general overview of what we covered on the talk, in the talk. We firstly went over the hacker mindset. So thinking of space systems as vulnerabilities from a hacker perspective and what a hacker would do in order to coordinate an attack. And then from there, outlining a threat model, which consists of looking over various attack surfaces intrinsic to a space system in order to identify specific vulnerabilities. And then we covered secure by design, which is stringently looking over what was found during the threat modeling process and developing and integrating guidelines into development standards. And lastly, we covered the future of security, where things are headed in terms of space and what sorts of technologies are being developed in that regard. Cool. Thank you so much again for attending this presentation. Let me know if you guys have any questions. I'll be happy to take some questions right now. If you have any questions after the presentation, feel free to talk to me or reach out to me via my email. You can also learn more about the work that I do on my website, also on my company site as well on StillRx Labs. But thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for your presentation. Very informative, interesting. I bet you're going to talk another hour and a half or more. Very interesting. Just touch the basis basically, but always very interested, actually to me at least. But I find it interesting about faking the payloads.
Yeah.
Could you a little bit enlighten me? How can you create your own payload to change altitude?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so that involves like the first 3 phases of attacking a satellite. So in order to make your own fake payload, you need to understand what communication standards the satellite adheres to. So this will include performing reconnaissance on any of the satellite communication subsystem components. So understanding what the satellite is using in terms of its receiver, its transmitter. And then after you do that, you need to get direct communications information about a satellite. So you need to understand what packet protocol it uses. I mentioned the space protocol or like CCSTS. So I would say it's a very integrated process of looking over which signals are being used by the satellite, reverse engineering it so you understand the structure of how information is being sent. And then once you have that, you can structure your own message. So let's say you have a satellite that's using like a space packet protocol. You could utilize that same template for your packet and then use a transmitter and send nefarious or like a spoofed packet. Although there are like barriers like on the satellite itself. So let's say like a satellite has secure firmware that can detect for like very absurd telemetry readings. So like let's say you wanted to tell a satellite to change its voltage. You know, it won't take a really large value, but you could trick it. So like, let's say you just wanted to send a specific value, you send a value and you can trick various subsystems on the satellite. So you can rotate the satellite solar panels, you can change the amperage, the current, you can do all sorts of things.
Amazing, thank you.
Yeah.
My name is Christian Calgarita for those. Thank you so much.
I have a question. About 5 years or so ago, our AIAA chapter had a speaker, and it was at the former TRW cafeteria. He was a former federal person, that they set up a cybersecurity program at Cal State Dominguez Hills, a graduate level. I want to know about, are there other programs like that? I'm not in this form of work, but
Yeah,
that's what I heard.
yeah, definitely. I would say there have been more events hosted by local organizations. I know there's going to be a Fusion Aerospace soon. There's also more online initiatives, so you can participate in like bug bounties, and online communities. Like there's online aerospace DEFCON communities, which allow you to like develop your own simulated environment for satellite systems. In terms of like getting more formal exposure, I would say conferences are your best bet. So you're seeing a lot of conferences. I think Hackspace Con. There's also like B-sides, but all those conferences have like aerospace sections now where you have custom like CTFs you can play, and various like organizations and employers who like create their own CTFs for the conference at hand.
If you don't mind, can I add a little bit to that? too?
Yes, yes.
So I work with a number of universities, and to kind of add to that answer is that there are a lot of universities now that are really focusing toward cybersecurity because they're starting to realize now that any person with some technical ability is able to go out and get hardware very easily nowadays, right? And be able to do, like Angelina was talking about, do some hacking. So now a lot of universities realize, hey, we have to change our focus because cybersecurity is going to be big. So a lot of universities, whether big, small, large, are starting to have either courses and or dedicated programs strictly for cybersecurity. So you'll see that a lot nowadays.
I think Mark online want to say something. Mark, I saw you were trying to say something. Do you want to go ahead? Oh, it's not. Oh, it is not there. Mark, do you want to say something? I saw you were trying to speak out.
Yes, I'd like to know what sort of job opportunities are available for recent graduates of a cybersecurity boot camp.
Yeah, you're seeing, from what I'm seeing in terms of like a technical and organizational standpoint, you're seeing a lot more job opportunities offered by organizations like SpaceX or more like defense-based organizations that provide more security-focused roles. So like for SpaceX, they have Starshield and Starlink initiatives, and with them, they're getting jamming and spoofing attacks all the time. So I would say, as a whole, there is a lot more opportunities available now for getting into security in the space sector, and you're seeing very integrated pathways in terms of career trajectory, because security can be ingrained in all aspects of development. So let's say you're a software developer, having a security background is really important. Even like a systems engineer needs to have a good understanding of how communication protocols need to be secured and how security fits together in a holistic standpoint. So I would say there are many opportunities if you do pursue security through a formal educational pathway, especially with like pre-established like aerospace organizations alongside like you can also go down a very deep rabbit hole with defense as well.
I see Robert online. Robert, Mr. Phipps,
Yeah.
do you want to speak up?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Excellent. To answer the question that was posed, a lot of companies have dropped their requirements for degrees to open up the cybersecurity field to those without formal education, like a bachelor's degrees. Recently saw some postings from Aerospace Corporation itself, where they were targeting folks with the high school degree diplomas to help with their security. Specifically was targeted at more the Air Force enlisted background, but someone with a cybersecurity boot camp that has like a Security Plus certification has a shot at a job these days. So I would encourage the person to get some certifications so they have something to throw on their resume. And if you are a young person like our speaker looking into a program, then yes, absolutely, get one of those cybersecurity degrees, and you got a great future there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for adding that. I appreciate it.
While we're waiting more questions, you mentioned the quantum computing, quantum
Yeah.
encryption thing. You mentioned it's an ESA.
Yeah, it was ESA. I know there's like a Chinese organization that like actually got a QKD message being sent. To be honest, I don't know too much about the quantum encryption sphere. But I think it is very interesting how it's being implemented.
Yeah, I think I know the news you're talking about. It's in quantum entanglement.
Yeah, to send messages.
So, okay. Yeah, because my question was because the quantum computer right now is still very limited. You know, IBM has a very big superconducting device, and some company has, but there's another group of company that just applying the algorithm but using regular computing. So I was not quite so sure what is the facility they are using.
Yeah, I'm not too sure about the technical details of that as
Okay.
well, but it'll be worth looking into.
Yeah.
Thanks for pointing it out.
Very, very good. So any more question here? Folks online, any question? Mr. Kumar Santosh, do you have a question? Go ahead.
Any thoughts on securing the PLM systems for which the CAD data for the aerospace companies, like Lockheed Martin, for example, F-35, it's well known that the Communist Chinese may have gotten access to plans for the F-35 as an example. At least that's what was reported publicly. And so any thoughts on cybersecurity in terms of securing the PLM systems and use of technologies such as encrypted storage media, hard drives, things of that nature as it relates to cybersecurity?
Yeah, I would say that relates to a point I made earlier in the presentation, having a more unified encryption system. So you don't have like proprietary encryption protocols all over the place. Having a unified encryption protocol would be really helpful. I don't have specialized experience with PLM systems, but that's what I would say intuitively.
Okay, so any more questions? Then
you don't mind, let me add a little bit to that as well. Because technologies are rapidly evolving, for example, you have RFIDs, active and passive, right? When I was working at Northrop, things were evolving so quickly because of potential vulnerabilities, such as magazines now having RFID on them. So now magazines are banned inside certain buildings, right? And so that's why, like, it's because things are getting so small and the capabilities are growing so fast that every opportunity now you have to look at as a possible vulnerability, right? To the point where we're banning magazines going into certain buildings, right? So a lot of companies like Northrop and the Lockheeds, they're looking at all different kind of areas that's coming in. USB sticks, years ago, USBs weren't very widely used in certain areas, but now that they are, now there's additional protocols, it's got to go through scanning, it's got to go through approvals, and so on and so forth, right? So they're constantly evolving daily, right? Understanding what's out there and what can be done with that kind of technology.
That's interesting, but what should we do? Elon Musk is doing this human brain. So men will be banned from entering those phone.
Yeah, that's not far off.
Cybersecurity does.
Correct.
Any more question? Obviously, this is a very exciting, topic. There's a lot of things going on, but just in terms of today's meeting, any question anymore? Okay, if not, let's thank Angelina again. Thank you. On behalf of the Los Angeles, Las Vegas section, we have a appreciation certificate to present. Angelina, so you can come forward. So thank you so much for your excellent presentation. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Let me first do this. Stay here, folks. Let me first start the recording first. Recording, recording, stop recording.